For 24 years, Judge Meredith Langford ruled the Jefferson County Courthouse in Birmingham, Alabama, with an iron grip. Her courtroom wasn't just a place for legal proceedings, it was a domain shaped by fear, intimidation, and unchecked authority. Attorneys, especially black lawyers, walked into her courtroom knowing they were at a disadvantage. Langford was infamous for her cold demeanor, rarely raising her voice, yet silencing entire courtrooms with a glance over her reading glasses. Her rulings followed a pattern that no one could prove, but everyone felt. Objections raised by certain attorneys were consistently overruled, while prosecutors, particularly those aligned with her biases, received subtle guidance from the bench. Over time, this pattern became part of the courthouse's unspoken reality, a known but unchallenged truth. Her legacy wasn't etched in plaques or celebrated in legal journals. It was whispered in hallways and discussed in hushed tones at legal gatherings. Attorneys learned quickly that arguing with Langford wasn't just futile, it could cost them their careers. Defendants of color, like Tyrone Wills, knew their chances at justice were slim the moment they stepped into her courtroom. Langford didn't need to manipulate evidence directly. Her influence over the rhythm of the courtroom, the timing of objections, the tone of cross-examinations, and the subtle nudging of jurors was enough to tip the scales. Her dominance stemmed not from loud declarations, but from decades of silent control, aided by a system that looked the other way. In many ways, she embodied the quiet but devastating power of systemic bias in the judicial system. Her courtroom became a stage where justice was often more performance than principle, and where those who dared to challenge her paid a steep price. But all of that would soon unravel when one man decided to push back. Darnell Hayes was not just another defense attorney. He was a force of resilience, principle, and quiet defiance in a system that was designed to break men like him. At 48 years old, Darnell had spent decades defending clients no one else wanted to touch, often going up against prosecutors and judges who had already decided the outcome before the trial began. But he never backed down. His name carried weight across Alabama for one reason. He fought hard, he fought smart, and he fought fair. When Tyrone Wills, a black man falsely accused of armed robbery, came to him, Darnell knew the stakes were higher than just winning a case. This wasn't just about Tyrone's freedom. It was about the deeply rooted corruption that had plagued the courtroom of Judge Meredith Langford for over 2 decades. Darnell had stood before her before, felt the sting of her dismissive tone and biased rulings, but this time he came prepared. Beneath his calm exterior was a man who had spent years gathering evidence, tracking patterns, and building a case, not just for his client, but against the very judge presiding over them. Langford underestimated him, dismissing his motions and objections as theatrics, but Darnell knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just defending Tyrone, he was setting a trap, letting Langford expose her bias in plain sight. Every time she interrupted him, overruled a valid objection, or guided the prosecution, she unknowingly helped build the case against herself. Darnell's strength wasn't in his volume. It was in his patience, his clarity, and his unshakable belief in justice. He knew that to challenge someone like Langford, he had to outthink her, not outshout her. And when the moment came, when federal agents walked into the courtroom and placed Langford under arrest, it wasn't just a personal victory. It was a reckoning. Darnell had done what few dared to even dream of. He had held power accountable. In doing so, he reminded the entire justice system that no one, not even a judge with 24 years on the bench, is above the law. His courage changed the course of one man's life, but more importantly, it cracked open a door that had long been shut, the possibility of justice, even in the most unjust of places. From the moment the trial began, it was evident that the proceedings were never meant to be fair. In Judge Meredith Langford's courtroom, justice was not blind, it was predetermined. Every aspect of the trial involving Tyrone Wills, a black man falsely accused of armed robbery, felt more like a performance than a pursuit of truth. The courtroom had a rhythm, and Langford controlled every beat. Her bias was neither subtle nor concealed. She dismissed every objection raised by defense attorney Darnell Hayes without consideration and guided the prosecution like a teacher coaching a favored student. Philip Calloway, the young assistant district attorney, stumbled through his arguments, but Langford was there to support him, correct him, and bolster his case in front of the jury. Meanwhile, Darnell's well-founded legal challenges were shut down with cold disregard. The imbalance was so glaring that even the jury began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the distortion of due process. Witnesses coached by the prosecution gave hesitant, uncertain testimonies, and yet Langford accepted their statements without scrutiny. When Darnell attempted to highlight inconsistencies or request clarification, she silenced him. Her authority wasn't used to ensure order or fairness. It was wielded as a weapon against anyone who dared to disrupt the outcome she had already chosen. The performance was polished and routine. Langford had spent 24 years perfecting it. But Darnell didn't just observe. He documented. He watched how every ruling favored the state, how Langford cut him off mid-sentence, how the jury was manipulated through tone and timing. She had no idea that her blatant actions were building the very case that would bring her down. While she believed she was silencing another black attorney, she was actually giving him all the ammunition he needed. The trial was not just compromised, it was corrupted. It became a textbook example of judicial misconduct, a stark reminder of how easily the law can be bent when power goes unchecked. What was meant to be a simple conviction turned into the unraveling of a judge's long-standing reign. And while Langford tried to maintain control, she failed to realize that her own arrogance and disregard for justice had already lost her the courtroom long before the final gavel would fall. What began as another rigged trial under Judge Meredith Langford's authority took a sharp and dramatic turn when Darnell Hayes revealed the full extent of his plan. For years, he had quietly built a case against Langford, collecting evidence of her misconduct, bribery, obstruction of justice, and systematic violation of civil rights. While she believed she was in control, Darnell had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came during Tyrone Will's trial, just as the judge reached a peak of arrogance, dismissing a clear Brady violation without hesitation. As tension filled the courtroom, the heavy double doors suddenly swung open. 2 federal agents entered, their presence slicing through the room like a blade. The entire courtroom froze. Judge Langford, caught off guard, demanded an explanation. One of the agents stepped forward and announced they had a federal warrant for her arrest. It was a stunning moment. After 24 years of unchecked power, Langford was being held accountable. The silence was deafening as the charges were read aloud. Bribery, abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. For the first time, Langford lost control of her courtroom. Her expression, once cold and commanding, shifted into disbelief and fear. Darnell stood calmly and addressed her with a quiet, cutting truth. I follow the law, even when the law fails people like me. As the handcuffs snapped around her wrists, the courtroom witnessed something unprecedented, a reckoning in real time. Reporters scribbled furiously. Jurors stared in stunned silence. Calloway, the young prosecutor, sat paralyzed, his entire strategy crumbling without Langford's guidance. The arrest wasn't just about one corrupt judge. It was a symbol that the system, however slowly, could correct itself. Darnell had not only defended an innocent man, but exposed years of hidden injustice. His victory wasn't loud or flashy. It was measured, intentional, and undeniable. The courtroom, once a stage for Langford's dominance, had become the scene of her downfall. And while the trial was not yet over, the power dynamic had permanently shifted. Justice, long delayed, had finally arrived, and it had done so in the form of a quiet, brilliant attorney who refused to be silent any longer. Judge Meredith Langford's arrest wasn't just a legal event, it was a powerful symbol of long-awaited reckoning. For 24 years, she had ruled her courtroom with unchecked authority, handing down biased rulings, silencing dissent, and upholding a system that failed people like Tyrone Wills. But now, the very bench from which she passed judgment stood empty, and the woman who once commanded fear and obedience was escorted out in handcuffs. The moment echoed through every corner of the courtroom, leaving behind a silence heavy with shock, awe, and quiet satisfaction. Reporters scribbled furiously to capture history in motion, while jurors, once passive observers, now stared in disbelief at the transformation of power. Even Philip Calloway, the young and once confident prosecutor, sat pale and shaken. His safety net gone, his strategy crumbled. But the most profound reaction came from Tyrone Wills, still seated, still in handcuffs, his future uncertain despite the monumental shift. His quiet words to Darnell, "I thought people like her never paid for what they did," carried the weight of generations who had watched justice bend around the powerful and crush the powerless. Darnell's steady reply, "They do, but the real lesson is still to come," reflected a deeper truth. Justice had been served, but the system remained deeply flawed. The arrest was a victory, yes, but it was only the beginning. The real triumph would come from continuing the fight, case by case, person by person. As Langford was led away, even the officer holding the door, a man who once bowed to her authority, treated her like any other defendant, completing the fall from power with quiet finality. That image, of a judge facing the very consequences she once handed down without mercy, burned into the minds of everyone present. It was a reminder that justice, though slow, can catch up. For Darnell, it wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring balance and giving voice to those who had been silenced. The courtroom, once a place of dread, now hummed with the possibility of change. And though Tyrone was finally freed, Darnell knew the mission was far from over. There were still more Langfords out there, hidden in black robes, protected by systems unwilling to confront the truth. But now, the fight had momentum, and the silence had been broken. Though the courtroom victory was powerful and symbolic, Darnell Hayes understood that it was only the beginning. Judge Meredith Langford's arrest sent shockwaves through the legal community, but the deeper issue, the corrupted foundation she represented, remained largely intact. As Tyrone Wills sat stunned, newly freed from the wrongful charges that had weighed heavily on him, he embodied a bittersweet truth. One man had gained his freedom, but countless others still languished in prisons shaped by the decisions of judges like Langford. The new judge's dismissal of all charges against Tyrone marked a crucial turning point, yet it also revealed the depth of damage caused by years of systemic injustice. Darnell stood steady, his eyes not just on the present moment, but on the future battles that lay ahead. Langford's downfall had proven that accountability was possible, but only through relentless effort, patience, and courage. Every document Darnell had gathered, every inconsistency he had exposed, was part of a greater mission. And even as the courtroom emptied and the tension began to fade, Darnell's resolve only grew stronger. He wasn't satisfied with just one victory. His thoughts turned to the many other defendants whose cases had passed through Langford's courtroom, whose voices had been silenced, and whose lives had been quietly destroyed by a system designed to favor power over truth. As Tyrone rubbed the red marks left on his wrists by the handcuffs, a haunting reality lingered. Freedom may have been granted, but justice had arrived late, after too much had already been lost. Darnell placed a reassuring hand on Tyrone's shoulder and told him the truth. This fight wasn't just about one man or one judge. It was about all the lives affected by a system that needed to change. Outside the courtroom, the world continued to spin, but for those who had witnessed what had just unfolded, everything had shifted. Darnell walked out with Tyrone, not into closure, but into the next phase of the battle. There were more Langfords out there, hiding behind titles and tradition,
But now, the illusion of untouchable power had been broken. Darnell wasn't finished, not even close. The fight for real justice had only just begun, and he intended to see it through no matter how long it took.
One of the most powerful lessons from this story is that true justice may be delayed, but it should never be abandoned. For years, Judge Meredith Langford operated with unchecked authority, silencing voices and distorting the truth. Yet it was the quiet persistence, patience and courage of one man, Darnell Hayes, that brought accountability to light. In life, we often face systems or individuals that seem too powerful to challenge. But this story reminds us that integrity, when held firmly, can break even the strongest walls of corruption. For older generations who have witnessed both injustice and progress, this is a reminder that change is possible, even when it feels too late. It teaches us to nurture truth, to mentor the next generation with wisdom, and to believe in the power of small actions done consistently over time. Darnell didn't win overnight. He planned, endured, and stood firm. And in doing so, he proved that standing up for what is right, even in the face of great power, is always worthwhile. Justice, like wisdom, often comes slowly, but when it does, it restores not just one life, but the soul of a community.